Bobby Torres of Frightbox Recording here. Are real amps overrated when it comes to recording metal guitar tones in the studio? Part 2. I think it's time for a haircut. So last week I put out a video where I play 5 audio samples of productions that I've done throughout the past 10 years of my career, some using amp sims and some using tube amps. Now the reason why I decided to do this is I hear so many strong opinions within the industry of people claiming that tube amps are a million times better than amp sims and nothing will beat a tube amp. And I also hear people that are fans of the Axe effects and Kemper and swear that they're just as good or better than a tube amp. And I'm here to tell you that it doesn't matter. You can get excellent results with both. And to be honest, if you know what you're doing, you can produce identical results with either one. So it really doesn't matter. It really comes down to what you prefer. Now, like I mentioned in the video last week, I'm a huge fan of reamping, not because reamping sounds better than amp sims, but because I just enjoy the process of recording real amps. But at the same time, half the productions I do feature amp sims. I know that at the end of the day, all that matters is what comes out of the speakers and if it sounds great to the listener. So as promised, I'm gonna dive deep into each of the individual mixes and reveal to you which of these mixes is using an amp sim and which are using real tube amps. So let's start with mix number 1. Now the first mix is of a production that I did a long time ago, 10 years ago. Now I always find it fun to dig back into my old mixes and see just how I did things way back in the day. I'm often amazed at how dumb I used to do things. But anyway, you live and you learn. Okay, so let's crack open this mix and let's take a listen. Okay, so the first thing I want to say is that I don't care if this is an amp sim or a real amp, this guitar tone is not good in my opinion. Not only that, but this session is kind of a disaster and not very well organized. I've become much more organized in my older age. But anyway, the truth is, this is a real amp, not an amp sim. And to be honest, I should have used an amp sim because this guitar tone is not very good. So let me see what's happening here. I'm gonna solo these guitar tracks, and let's hear what this tone sounds like in solo. Okay, so this is more of a rock production than a metal production, but as you can hear, the tone is just very boxy. It sort of works with the overall production, but if I were to re-record the song, I would definitely not go for this guitar tone. It just doesn't sound very appealing to me. And yeah, it's a real amp, and all I have is a little bit of EQ. That's it. Just a small amount of EQ on the tracks themselves, no compression, no nothing. Sample number 1 was a real amp, not an amp sim. So let's move on to mix number 2. Okay, if we look here, I have a 5150 on the left and a 5150 on the right. 2 DI tracks that are completely zeroed out and not being used, so these are real amps, no amp sims. And as far as processing on the individual tracks, like I said, I have 2 DI tracks that were just used for reamping that are not being used in the mix at all. And I just have the 2 5150 tracks with a little bit of multi-band compression, and it looks like some EQ. And that's it. So mix number 2, again, are real amps, no amp sims. So far the first mix were real amps, and the second mix were real amps. Now, if you notice, there's a drastic difference between the 2 tones, and it's simple. 10 years ago, I just didn't have a lot of experience miking cabs. I used to overcomplicate the process by trying out all different mics that really didn't make much of a difference, trying out many different cabs when I should have just stuck with one cab that sounded right, and I should have just used a single SM57 on the right spot on that cab, which I was obviously doing 3 years ago. So remember, when it comes to recording your metal guitars, always keep it simple. If you're using a cab that doesn't sound right, you could try every microphone placement under the sun, every EQing technique under the sun. Your tone is not gonna be great. It all starts with the source. Okay, and that was mix number 2. Let's go on to mix number 3.
Sometimes I feel like you don't hate me. Sometimes I feel I'm not
Okay, now if you look here, I have a DI on both the left and right sides, along with a printed tone. But here's the thing, this printed tone is from an amp sim. It is not from a live amp, which I find funny because a lot of people guess this to be a live amp, but it's not. It's an amp sim. So let's take a look at what's happening on the back end of the guitar tone. Yeah, really simple. So again, I have my two DI tracks, which did have an amp sim loaded on them. That tone was then printed down as if they were live amps. And as you could tell, I'm processing them in the exact same way, just a little bit of multi-band compression and a little bit of EQ, rolling off a little bit of the lows, some of the top end, and some slight notching at some problem frequencies, but nothing extreme, just a dB or two at a few different frequencies. So let's see what was happening in my actual amp sims before they were printed. Okay, so I had the same tone on both sides. It's just a TSC Audio X50 with a tube screamer, loaded with my favorite impulse response of my favorite cab out of my studio, which is a Mesa Boogie oversized 4x12. Very simple, I created these impulse responses with a single SM57 on the right spot on a V30. Now, I mentioned in last week's video that I would reveal to you any special tricks that I might be using in order to make amp sims sound like real amps within a mix. And to be honest with you, here's the trick. I'm using a good impulse response. Now, I don't know why, but there's so many bad sounding impulse responses out on the internet. So much so that I was never able to find one that worked for me until I started making my own. So for me, that's the trick to making amp sims work, is to use a good impulse response. If you have a crappy impulse response, you could have the most high-end, fancy pants plugin in the world, and it's not gonna sound good. So if you would like to make your own life easier and you'd like to download this impulse response, you could do so for absolutely free. I'm gonna leave a link within this video's description where you could go, download the impulse response, load it into any amp sim plugin that you're using, and get right to making great sounding music. Okay, so let's hear these guitars in solo. Okay, just a standard, hard-hitting, hard rock guitar tone. It's clear, but not too bitey. It's warm, but not too muddy. Just a straight ahead, solid, hard rock or metal tone. That's the other thing that I wanna say, is that people get too caught up in gear in general, where they think they need a special amp for every subgenre of music that they work on. In my opinion, if you have a 5150, you could do any type of hard rock or metal that you wish. Your overall technique and workflow is infinitely more important, in my opinion. Okay, and here we are with mix number 4. Now, I actually screwed up last week. I said that this mix was 7 years old. It's actually 9 years old. I recorded this in 2011. So let's take a listen, and then I will reveal to you if it's a real amp or an amp sim. Let's check it out. Okay, and if you're paying close attention, you see this thing that says Marsh. That's because this is a Marshall and this was a real amp. I don't remember what exact Marshall head I was using, but it was definitely through my favorite Mesa Boogie cab out of my studio that I've made impulse responses from. So this was a live amp. Now this mix is very old. Again, I did this 9 years ago. So let's see what's happening on the back end of this guitar tone. And I can tell already that my mix is a little more organized. My session's a little more organized than the one from 2010. But it's still sort of a disaster. Okay, if you look here, I have a DI on the left and a DI on the right. Both tracks are inactive because I was just using them for reamping. And then here are my two Marshall tracks. Let's see what my EQ looked like. Very subtle EQ. Now, I've mentioned this in previous videos, but the longer I've been doing this, the less and less drastic my EQ on my guitars become. That's because I'm much more picky and I make sure I get my tone right at the source. It's really important. Yeah, both guitars have very similar EQ, almost exactly the same. Just a little bit of a roll off on top, roll off on the bottom, and a slight bit of nudging in the low mids and the upper mids. And these guitars are routed to a submix called guitars. Yes, here's my guitars track, and all I have is a C4. So as you can tell, I've been utilizing a very simple approach for about 9 years now. And the other funny thing is quite a few people guess this particular track to be an amp sim from what I remember. And of course, no, it's a real amp. Pretty decent tone too. I actually kind of like this tone. Let's check it out once more. just a straightforward solid hard rock or metal tone. It's warm, but not overly muddy, and it's crisp, but not too bitey. Just the way I like it. And as you can tell, no fancy trickery happening here, just a touch of EQ and just a little bit of multiband compression to control some of the palm mutes. Okay, so let's close this session and go on to mix number 5. Okay, and here we are in mix number 5. Let's see what we have. Okay, so if you look here, I have 2 DI tracks, one on the left, one on the right. Neither one of them are being used in the mix. And I have an amp tone, one on the left, one on the right, and this is an amp sim. Again, much like the other mix that was using an amp sim, it is a printed version of the amp sim, just so I can mix it as if it were a live amp. I do this, it's more of a workflow thing than anything else. You don't have to necessarily print your guitar tracks. I just do it again because it looks visually more like a live amp on my screen. So let's look at what's happening within the mix. Yes, again, the TSE Audio X50, loaded with the exact same impulse response, except this is more of a metal tone and less of a rock tone. And the way I achieved more of a metal tone is simply by different controls on the amp. Nothing fancy. Again, you do not have to make production and guitar tone rocket science. If you're doing a rock thing, maybe a little more mid-range, maybe a little less gain. If you're doing a metal thing, maybe a little more gain, maybe a little less mid-range. The production gods will not punish you if you break the rules. There are no rules. So again, the tone was printed, so the actual amp sims themselves are completely zeroed out, and the tracks are just printed versions of the amp sims. Again, a little bit of C4 to control palm mutes, touch of EQ. I have a little more mid-range scooped out. I scooped out a little more mid-range just to make room for the mid-range of the bass, because this is more of a metalcore thing. And this other plugin is just a trim plugin for automation. It's not doing anything to the sound itself. So let's hear this guitar tone in isolation. Yeah, in my opinion, a nice meaty metal tone. That's not overly low-endy to the point where it's ruining the low end of my mix. There's just enough to fill out the low end, but still be present and audible within the mix with a nice crisp top end. Okay, so once again, just to recap, mix number 1 was a real amp. Mix number 2 was a real amp. Mix number 3 was an amp sim. Mix number 4 was a real amp. And mix number 5 was an amp sim. Now this is really interesting. At the time of this taping, not one single person has been able to guess which tone was a real amp and which tone was an amp sim. Again, that's because amp sims can sound exactly like real amps if you're using a solid impulse response. Now for some reason, certain purists get really bent out of shape about this, but I never understood why. Again, I love real amps. I love dialing in real tube heads. I love messing around with mic placement. When I'm playing with a band, I love the feeling of a real tube amp behind me. But when it comes to production, all that matters is the sound that's coming out of your speakers. That's it. Now, if you're running a home studio, why are you gonna spend a boatload of money on crap you don't need? It doesn't really make sense. Your money will be better off spent elsewhere, in my opinion. This is why I like to use a handful of tube amps at the studio, and I don't go crazy buying every other boutique amp that's released on the market. Because at the end of the day, you could achieve great results with amp sims or tube amps. Just depends on your preferred workflow. And again, if you only have access to amp sims, it won't hold you back if you're using a solid impulse response. And again, if you don't have a solid impulse response, you could download mine for absolutely free. There's a link below right within this video's description. Download it, load it to your amp sim plugin, and again, like I said before, get right to making music and not worrying about these dumb things that people obsess over in the studio. Now, even though I just proved it in this video, do you still think tube amps sound better than amp sims? I'd love to hear your opinion. Drop a comment in the comment section below and let me know. It always generates an interesting dialogue, and I just love hearing other artists' opinions on gear, production philosophy, whatever. If you found this video helpful, like, comment, subscribe, and share. And do not forget to click the little bell icon so you can be notified every time I upload one of our weekly videos on all things metal and rock production. You can both like and follow me on Facebook and Instagram. Links are in the description below. And until next time, happy recording.